Hello, it's Scott Manley here. As you probably heard by now, the nomination of Jared Isaacman to be administrator of NASA was yesterday pulled by the Trump White House, and that has left a bit of a void, and of course has left a number of people unhappy. There had been stories for a while that his nomination was always in jeopardy, that because of his connections to Elon Musk, he was able to sidestep a lot of the party political purity tests that other Trump appointees had to go through. And then Laura Loomer said it was the deep state that was against Jared because of his connections to Elon Musk. Well, Elon has been a pretty significant presence in the last few months, spearheading the Department of Government Efficiency. It sounds like he's fallen out of favour in the last week or so, partly because, well, Doge hasn't delivered quite the level of cuts that they had hoped. And that's somewhat understandable given the opposition from the affected agencies and the politicians on both sides of the aisle who support these agencies. But many people think a bigger issue was when he publicly criticised a bill which was going to add trillions to the deficit and effectively undo the work that they had been doing. And this was, of course, Trump's big, beautiful bill. Now, look, we cannot be certain, and there's a lot of other things going on. We don't have an insight into exactly what's happening, but we did know that there was supposed to be a 130-day limit on these like special government employees, the position that Elon was taking, which didn't require the creation of an agency. It was more like created via executive order or something else. But whatever the underlying reasons, once Elon steps back, Jared becomes vulnerable to all the existing issues that had been discussed in the past. And the White House pretty much said, well, because of previous associations were pooling the Isaacman nomination, previous associations is probably he had donated to people who weren't Republicans. And that isn't a surprise. They've known that for a very long time. But whatever, it's been decided that someone else is going to lead NASA. I'm not sure they're going to bring back Jim Bridenstine because, well, he supported candidates who weren't Trump. Eric Berger's article, he talks about former Air Force Lieutenant General Stephen Quast. While he's retired, he does have a distinguished record and he's publicly been loyal to Trump. And there's also Scott Pace, who ran the Space Council under Trump back during the first term. But whatever, I don't think they're going to get the same level of support that Isaacman was getting from the space community. And, to be honest, given the funding prospects for NASA and the hard decisions that are going to have to be made, I would not actually want to be in charge of NASA and trying to square away the deep cuts to the good programs. This might give Jared time to go back and fly those other two Polaris missions that he'd discussed. Maybe he can get to the moon before China. But seriously, the Artemis program is still pretty well funded in the proposed budget. It's the research, right, the technology development that is largely being defunded. And so, almost coincidentally, this week we also had the latest update from SpaceX, from Elon Musk specifically, about their Mars plans, about the Starship program plans. And I honestly, this was on Thursday. It was originally supposed to be on Tuesday before the launch of Starship. Then it ended up being scheduled for after the launch. And then the launch didn't go quite as they planned. And then it was just sort of snuck out as a video release rather than a live stream on the Thursday. Now, initially, I just listened to it, and I didn't hear much in the way of new news or any specifics that hadn't already sort of crossed my mind or had already been derived by, watchers of the program. But as we look through some of the presentation, it turns out there's a few things worth commenting about. First of all, this is actually some footage that was released from the flight, from on Twitter. I actually compiled this into a multi-angle short. Looks pretty awesome to see the staging, in particular the camera which was inside the engine bay of Starship. And the B-roll that they started the event with, that was some pretty cool bits of B-roll there. Very photogenic. We'll probably find it in its way into some of my DJ sets going forwards. I like that we got some angles of Starship development and prep inside the bay, including, of course, the Pez dispenser and not the Starlinks, the dumb links that were supposed to go inside there. All sorts of jaw-dropping shots of people working with actual hardware. Like this one that has the tiles on the nose cone before it's actually assembled. There's a whole lot of shots that show human for scale. And of course, a carefully curated selection of very photogenic engine tests. But the first part that had me pausing the video was this shot of the control room. And I'll be honest, I didn't really learn very much, but it was interesting to look at the different plumbing diagrams. Awesome shots of the booster and the Starship being mated, system being tested, and of course, a launch with the most intense camera angle ever. And then the various launch highlights had to come from different flights because the position of the sun varied. For example, that had to have been Flight 5 or previous because the sun was rising over the Gulf. This was from Flight 7 based upon the serial numbers of engines 371 and 388. And then if we skip forward through to the staging footage, we see one moment, Starship 33, which of course was Flight 7. And then we get some awesome booster descent footage. I'm sure you can figure out which flight it's from, but I do know the landing has to have come from flight number 5 because the sun is once again rising over the Gulf. And again, we get a mashup of different cool bits of Starship footage showing this descent. And then, of course, we get the only landing that has happened in daylight from flight number 6. As I said, this is a phenomenal highlight reel of Starship footage. We even get Elon blowing his mind from like flight number 2. And then we switch over to one vision of the future. A Starship in Mars orbit. And the one thing that jumps out here is that it says approach phase and it shows it in a circular Mars orbit. Now, if you're flying from Earth to Mars typically now, you just go from a hyperbolic orbit directly to the Martian surface. But if you are flying something like Starship to Mars with a large number of spacecraft during a limited window, you might actually want to go from a hyperbolic orbit into an aerocapture orbit and then eventually land, because this lets you park Starships in orbit while you wait for a landing pad to become available. Anyway, the presentation itself was primarily Elon talking to what looked like employees of SpaceX. It seemed to be a much smaller crowd than some of the previous events. And you know, that's fine. I mean, Elon really needs to motivate his workers to work around the clock and push out those rockets, pump out those numbers, right? And while he's talking over a video about the evolution of Starbase, I'm looking at this structure behind him, which is obviously a section of a Super Heavy or Starship tank, but there we have it. This looks like a new interstage design for the Super Heavy booster. So the first thing you see is the strut type support, and this of course makes it look like an old Soviet rocket. And it got me to thinking that between having, 30 plus state-of-the-art staged combustion, hydrocarbon-based engines, having this strut structure, having grid fins, and of course having a test program that largely involves launching full-scale articles, it does make it sound a lot like the Soviet N-1 rocket, doesn't it? And look, I know the N-1 wasn't successful, but that was because of lack of support, and thankfully, this is being supported and has managed many more flights than the N1 ever did, and arguably more success. Anyway, the other thing I noticed is that the forward structure of that tank is a dome shape, as opposed to the existing truncated cones that we see on the current hot staging system. Which in turn makes me wonder, is that forward dome designed to be a part of the tank? Is it supposed to be more secure against the rocket blast because it has pressurized propellant inside it? And if that's the case, surely then that would imply that there must be cavities, sealed cavities behind those ports for the grid fins. It'll be interesting to see how this turns out. And he does actually talk about the specific scales of the future designs on the boosters. Anyway, moving forward, as quickly as this playback will allow me, again, looks at the history of Starbase, including the construction of the new buildings. I mean, I remember when this program started out and they were literally welding stuff together in a field, and then came the tents because they needed tents to protect the structures from, the welding from the winds. Now we get to 2025, we've got the big bays, and he starts talking about the next step forward in making Starship a rocket factory, the Giga Bay, which will potentially be the largest structure, the largest building in the world. And if you look down the bottom, you'll see the road kind of goes off in both directions. That implies that it's like a super wide-angle rendering, but it's interesting that the doors from this structure basically lead directly onto the road. And so that means if they manage to hit their goal of 1,000 Starships a year, which is
kind of crazy, to be honest. They will be having 1,000 road closures a year as they have to wheel these down the highway. I'm not saying that's going to happen by any means, but you know, the SpaceX has managed to scale up their Falcon 9 second stage production quite substantially. I mean, we've just had May 2025 finish, and we had like 17 launches, I think, so that's more than one every 2 days. And yeah, then this is comparison of like building stuff out. Again, I don't think they're going to get 1,000 anytime soon. And frankly, I don't think you need 1,000 starships per year until you are launching a large number of them to Mars. And basically, they have to spend 2 years away, so you need to send a lot during 1 month of the year, and then they all come back, a couple of years down the line. So anyway, skipping forward, we get to the discussion of rapidly reusable rockets. Are the pirates? Are we going to make space pirates? Hopefully not. And we know the drill by now, right? The Super Heavy and the Starship are designed to be rapidly reusable. That's one of the reasons why they don't have landing legs, why they land back on their launch structure. So the launch structure can put the stuff back into the launch pad and get it ready for launch again. But also, by eliminating the landing legs, you are reducing the amount of mass that has to carry, and that gives you a direct advantage in terms of the amount of payload. And most of us were very skeptical when we first heard about this crazy plan to catch the rockets by, we thought it was the grid fins because those were logical. But no, they have even smaller, tiny little pins, and they've proven that it's possible. And, this is like one of the highlights of the program, that this has been proven to be possible. So at the moment, we're looking at earliest Flight 11 before this is even attempted. Although, to be honest, I wouldn't put it past them having like a suborbital test flight for this particular feature. It would allow them to iterate a little more rapidly. And now the challenge is to do this with Starship. And as you know, they've had some problems actually getting Starship V2 to fly successfully. And then we got some footage of Raptor 3 testing. And frankly, it looks a little like CGI, but it is the real thing. And, many people have commented about the incredibly clean design of Raptor 3, but the truth is, what's really happening is, while they have moved a lot of complexity inside the structure, a lot of the exterior structure that we are seeing is basically heat shielding. These engines are being designed so that they can get exposed to the hypersonic airflows that will be experienced during landing and survive. And incidentally, if you watch this test sequence, you can see frost building up on the regeneratively cooled nozzle section, while the nozzle extension doesn't have any frost because it's not cooled. Propellant transfer, that's something that is still very much needing to be solved. It's something that has to be in Starship's future if it's going to have a use above low Earth orbit. I mean, it seems easy enough, right? You're just taking fuel and pumping it from one spacecraft into another. This is something that's already been done with hypergolic propellants on the International Space Station. And if you look carefully at this animation, you can see there's these little mating legs that come out from one ship to the other. And I'm going to guess the one that is extending the legs is the tanker, because the tanker primarily is working in low Earth orbit. The one that is having to leave Earth orbit, you don't want to have it carrying that excess mass into deep space. Now we talk about the heat shield, and I'm really glad that he highlights this issue with the atomic oxygen in Martian environment. I've kind of mentioned this a couple of times, but spacecraft hit the atmosphere so hard that there are chemical reactions, and it matters what kind of atmosphere you're hitting. There's this naive tendency for people to think that, well, the Martian atmosphere is lower pressure, lower density, therefore it doesn't matter as much as the Earth's atmosphere. But the thing is, you have to hit the same density of atmosphere to have the braking effect. So with Mars, yes, the atmosphere is less dense, you just have to go deeper inside it to get comparable conditions to what you expect on Earth, and you need those conditions to get the braking capability that you need to get captured by Mars. Starship still has a lot of work to do in terms of the heat shield. It's not just a case of making tiles that can survive the thermal and chemical conditions, they have to be able to be fitted and replaced, and the spacecraft has to handle the loss of a tile in a graceful manner without having a whole bunch of holes burned in the structure. And so the next section looks at evolutions, next generation versions of the Starship and the Super Heavy. We still see the Booster 33 engines. Looks like it's taken out a grid fin, the one that sits on the leeward side relative to the Starship spacecraft on top. I'm presuming that's not a rendering error, but it definitely looks interesting that they would do that. Obviously, that relies on the booster coming in at a specific angle and using only the three grid fins to control its descent. And the three grid fins are confirmed in this particular render. Also note that the forward hot staging area, that doesn't include the curved bulkhead. I'm not sure if that's a mistake or if that is going to be different from what he's basically standing in front of. And then, yeah, it confirms that by having all the heat shielding on the engines itself, it means that they don't have to have the large skirt area on it. Again, hey, it looks like a rendering mistake. No, that's the plan. And there's great advantages in getting rid of that large, shielding area at the back. It means that you don't have large volumes in which fuel leaks can accumulate and potentially combust. If you only have very small pieces of conformal shielding, it means the space for leaks to ignite become much smaller and the potential problems with an unplanned combustion, get minimized. Again, we see this with the dome in this situation, so it looks good. So now then, future versions of Starship, again, small iterations are being done on this, but they're significant redesigns of the vehicle. So the main thing to catch here is we get shown a section of the aft bay here with just the standard 6 engines, but you'll notice that the false ceiling has now gone. Again, that's where they've been having these fires. That's where they've had to have the fire suppression system. So getting rid of that minimizes a number of failures that they've had in the past and would ideally reduce the amount of mass required in terms of structure so that they can increase the amount of mass in terms of payload. And then there's this final slide that shows that the V2 Starship and the V2 booster will eventually be replaced by the V3, which will be stretched versions of both of those. And the Starship will gain 3 extra vacuum engines, meaning that yes, 33 plus 9 is 42, as Douglas Adams prophesied. The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, and yeeting masses into orbit. He's talking about 200 tons to orbit in fully reusable mode. I think that's a tall order. It would be nice for it to happen, but I'll believe it when I see it. Even half of that would still be revolutionary. And now we get to some renderings of future plans. Yes, we know that they're going to have to land on the moon. That is a new leg design that I am seeing here. And if you zoom all the way in, you could see somebody wearing a SpaceX EVA suit on the surface of the moon. I've had a lot of Mars fanboys tell me that, no, we cannot go to the moon anymore, we should go direct to Mars. But I say, we should go to the moon because that's the one place where you can test a lot of stuff that you need to test for Mars. And you can do it every day, every week, every month, rather than once every 2 years. EVA suits, they are not a solved problem. Nobody has used a surface-capable EVA suit for over 50 years. NASA are currently testing them in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, but that's a far cry from actually testing it in operational environments. So yeah, this is where the plans get into definitely big future plans. They would love to send a spacecraft to Mars in 2026. That is a massively tall order. That will depend on solving all their refueling problems, all their launch problems, all their propulsion in orbit problems, all their refueling, all their propellant management problems. If all those are solved, and Elon gives it a 50-50 chance, which I think is highly optimistic, but it would be nice if it did actually happen. Yeah, you'll get the launch window in 2026, and that will enable you to send a spacecraft, and it will be able to get to Mars, perform an atmospheric, braking maneuver, and then a landing somewhere on the surface of Mars. Possibly it even lands upright and doesn't fall over. But then we get to a diagram which is kind of like a an aspirational timeline in terms of their plans for Mars. And the way I read this is each blue line represents a flight going to Mars, like launching at different parts of the window and arriving at different parts of the window. The ones at the start and the end need extra delta V. You have more towards the middle. The red ones, those are the ones that come back from Mars. Because I think you would want at least a couple of Mars window tests where you send a spacecraft and it comes back 2 years later, and maybe another time, before you actually put humans on this thing. That's why they're talking about like the 2030 to 31. Again, hugely optimistic, probably not happening. I think multiply the time lags here by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4. Whatever. It's still faster advancement than we were looking at under previous Mars mission designs. But again, a lot of these technologies that they talk about here, these are things that I strongly believe that they should be testing this kind of thing on the moon, because going to the moon in a few days lends itself much better to iterative development, as opposed to Mars, where you have to commit to 2 years and then it takes you 2 years to then have another attempt if you discover that there is a problem. He specifically identifies the Arcadia region on Mars, and I'm pretty sure the planetary protection people are having fits over this. The places you want to go are the places with water. The places with water are the places that could potentially harbour native Martian life. And the odds of discovering and proving that it came from Mars tend to disappear once you start contaminating it with humans. That being said, Tesla is developing humanoid robots, so it does feel that there is some synergy between this. I do think it's funny that they just took a Starship with a Pez dispenser, and the only legs in this photo are for the humanoid robot rather than the landers that are going to need to land on an unprepared surface on Mars. There will be formidable technical problems that have to be solved to make humanoid robots work on Mars. I mean, there are already formidable technical problems on Earth. Having said that, one particular naysayer told me that the radiation environment on Earth would make these things impossible, and that's bogus, because the radiation environment on the surface of Mars is actually pretty benign compared to radiation, for example, in the vicinity of the moon, and we've already seen iPads flying up there and operating just fine. It's not ideal, but it's not the showstopper that some people think. If I were the robot designer, the thing that I would be most concerned about is the range in temperatures, the cooling issues with a much lower atmospheric pressure, and of course, the very fine Martian dust and those, highly engineered joints. And by the way, if I were Starship designer, I would have some sort of plate to cover that umbilical, because the Martian dust is going to get in there and ruin your seals. I mean, look, there's all sorts of problems to be solved if you're putting robots on the surface of Mars, but there are way more problems to be solved with having humans on the surface of Mars. And frankly, if a robot dies on the surface of Mars, it's much easier to fix it as opposed to fixing a human on Mars. So humans on Mars, yeah, we're still talking 2030s, and I am fine with that timescale. 2040s, I am fine with. It would still be beyond my sci-fi wildest dreams. We get some ballpark back-of-the-envelope math for how much mass they need to launch to Mars. Ideally, you want to make it as self-sufficient as possible, but I mean, considering there is such a diverse list of products that are generated on the Earth, it's hard to think about having machinery to do every single thing. I mean, are we going to import animals so that people can have steaks? Or will the technology that allows lab-grown meat to solve the problem for us? These are the kind of questions that are going to be answered over decades if this program continues to grow. And to have it continue to grow, it's going to continue to be funded by Starlink. And yeah, there was also a mention of MarsLink. They'll obviously have the Martian version of Starlink developed. Those will fly in higher orbits since we don't need nearly as many of them because there aren't that many people on Mars right now. And unlike Earth, you're not going to have homesteaders that are just setting up their ranch in the middle of nowhere to get away from things. They're going to tend to have to be near where they can get a supply of air and water and stuff like that. Again, these are very much 22nd century concerns. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.